Erlebnis Irland. Reisen zum Hören. Dingle. Hallo, hier ist wieder Fee und Chris mit unserer zweiten Folge unseres Podcasts Erlebnis Irland. Jeder Irlandfan kennt Dingle. Früher mal ein beschauliches Fischerstädtchen mit bunten Booten. Heute gibt es da den Delfin Fungi, leckeres Essen, tolle Landschaften, wilde Klippen, Ringforts, viele Schafe und noch mehr Touristen. Der Delfin hat sogar zwischenzeitlich ein Denkmal bekommen. Wir waren das erste Mal auf der Halbinsel, um über die keltische Geschichte Irlands zu schreiben. Damals lernten wir auch unseren Guide TP kennen. Er ist ein bekannter Lokalhistoriker, Campingplatz- und Pubbesitzer und ein wahnsinnig guter Geschichtenerzähler. Und er steht auf deutsche Autos. In dieser Podcast-Folge geht es zwar nicht um ihn, aber er war einer der Iren, die unsere Begeisterung für dieses Land geweckt haben. Als Vorbereitung für diese Reise habe ich auch die Aufnahmen unserer alten Interviews von damals gewälzt. Die sind schon ein paar Jahre alt und ursprünglich nicht für einen Podcast gedacht, sondern sie waren eine Gedächtnisstütze für die Zeitungsberichte, die wir damals geschrieben haben. Aber ich denke, dass wir durchaus auch ein paar Podcast-Folgen daraus machen können, die wir euch dann auch noch bereitstellen werden. Zurück aber zu Dingle. Wie bei allen unseren Folgen steckt dahinter auch eine besondere Geschichte. Fee und ich gehören jetzt nicht gerade zu den Alkoholtrinkern und es ist noch gar nicht so lange her, da wussten wir noch gar nicht, was sich hinter dem Begriff Gin verbirgt. Aber das sollte sich vor 2 Jahren ändern. Also unser Freund TP hat uns ja entsprechend angefixt und für Irland und insbesondere für Dingle sensibilisiert. Deshalb stach uns bei unserem nächsten Besuch in Bantry im letzten Jahr etwas besonders ins Auge. Zunächst hielten wir das allerdings für einen Marketing-Gag. Im Schaufenster eines Pubs stand eine recht noble Flasche mit der Aufschrift Dingle. Ich glaube, es war sogar das Ma Murphys in Bantry. Das Ma Murphys zählt zu einem der ursprünglichsten und populärsten Pubs in Irland. Seit den 50ern unverändert, vorne Laden, hinten Bar. Wir hatten noch die Gelegenheit, uns mit Bill, dem Besitzer, zu unterhalten. Ein echtes irisches Urgestein. Für ihn gehört jeder seiner Pubbesucher zur Familie. Leider ist er dieses Jahr an Krebs gestorben. Aber es wird in dieser Serie einen eigenen Podcast über ihn und seinen Pub geben. Bis zu diesem Zeitpunkt war uns Dingle im Zusammenhang mit hochprozentigem oder mit Wacholderschnaps kein Begriff. Wir erfuhren allerdings, dass sich hinter dem Namen ein kleines, junges Startup verbirgt, das sich der irischen Tradition der Herstellung irischen Whiskys verschrieben hat. Whiskys, Gin und Wodka. In Irland Wodka. Das machen sie mit vielen kreativen und spannenden Ideen. So schickt sich das junge Team an, den europäischen Markt zu erobern. Also zwischenzeitlich gibt es durchaus ziemliche Engpässe. Das mussten wir auch feststellen, als wir letztes Jahr eine Flasche Dingle mit nach Hause nehmen wollten. Das Ergebnis war, wir haben sie von Deutschland aus im Internet bestellt. Das Startup hat sich ausgerechnet am Randgebiet von Dingle angesiedelt. Direkt an der R559, das ist die Straße, die auch zum Sleehead Drive führt. Und zwar in einem alten Sägewerk mit riesigem roten Müllrad. Ein innovatives Unternehmen als Kontrastprogramm zu Tourismus und tonnenweise alten Steinen mit Geschichte. Das war Grund genug, der Dingle Distillerie unsere zweite Podcast-Folge zu widmen. Und nein, das ist keine Werbung und auch keine Produktplatzierung. Wir bekommen dafür auch nichts. In dieser Folge interviewt Destiller Michael Walsh, mit noch nicht ganz 30 Jahren einer der jüngsten Chefdestiller, den es weltweit überhaupt gibt.
My name is Michael Walsh. I'm the head distiller here in the Dingle whiskey distillery. So we've been producing artisan whiskey, gin and vodka for just over 5 years now, and I've been fortunate enough to be here from the very beginning. I started off in production, and just a couple of years ago now I was fortunate enough to take up the mantle as head distiller here. At the time, and still one of the youngest head distillers in the world, so I'm very fortunate for the opportunity I've been given here. So yeah.
How did you come to produce gin or vodka here in the heart of Kerry?
Well, there was quite a large degree of planning went into the distillery here. About 8 to 10 years worth of planning and thought process before we actually came to setting up the distillery in 2012. A lot of the reasoning behind setting up a distillery was the fact that Irish whiskey sales then and still to this day are the fastest growing spirit category in the world. So for the last 15 or so years, Irish whiskey sales have been growing by over 20% year on year. But up until we got involved, it was all being produced by just 3 distilleries. Now, at one time in Ireland's history, we would have had over 2,000 distilleries on the island, but due to various economic reasons, the turn of the last century, there was complete and utter collapse of the Irish whiskey industry due to independence from Britain and an economic war and US prohibition. Most distilleries shut down in the country, and for over 100 years, there wasn't a new one to open up until we arrived. So we've started here just over 5 years ago, producing. We're by far the smallest distillery producing whiskey here in the country, and with probably a slightly different ethos to some of the more mass-produced whiskies that are happening in the other distillery. We wanted to come out and really get back to that, the quality of distillate that Ireland was once famed for, as far as whiskey production was concerned. And with that, we built a team, and I probably would say this, a team of very talented distillers, capable of producing a very good whiskey, but also a very good gin and vodka. So we decided to do that also. So when we set up the distillery, we're the only ones on the island. At that time, there was no other vodka distillery. I suppose Ireland wouldn't necessarily be famed for vodka, but we decided to set up a vodka distillery and a gin. It's a lot smaller in scale compared to our whiskey side of our things. We have a lot smaller distillation equipment because I suppose at the time, although there was massive growth in the whiskey sector here in Ireland and internationally as well for Irish whiskey, we didn't envisage the growth that was going to happen, particularly with the gin. But in the last 5 years, gin sales have been absolutely crazy. Our gin, we're happy to say, has been one of the more popular ones, not the most popular here in Ireland, only shackled by the fact that we can't actually make more than what we produce at the moment. So for about 3 years now, we've been at production capacity for both our gin and vodka and not able to service domestic demand. So we use very specialised equipment, which namely our pot stills that we get from 4 sites of Scotland, and with that there's a couple of years of waiting time from the time of ordering. So we're happy to say that our new still has arrived. A new still to produce gin and vodka has arrived. We're in the process now of just commissioning it and just doing the final pipe works. But the idea behind this is to facilitate more international growth. We have, like I said, we've been very popular here domestically, but because of the domestic success, there hasn't been much gin left over that we can export. So we have routes to market in Germany and North America, right throughout Europe, and as far away as Australia and New Zealand. But although there's distributors and potential customers crying out for the products internationally or for our products, we just don't have enough. So in the next couple of weeks now, when we get this new still up and running, we'll be able to return in greater volumes to those international markets as well.
What makes Irish whiskey different to Scottish whiskey?
Well, I suppose there's nothing to stop. There's traditional or there's stereotypical Irish whiskies, or there's certain traits that most Irish distilleries would have that would be different to what Scottish distilleries would have. Namely, that there's far less of a tendency to use peat here in Ireland compared to Scotland, as well as that Irish whiskey tends to be triple distilled, whereas Scotch whiskey tends to be double distilled. They would be your most obvious differences, but there's nothing to stop an Irish distiller from double distilling, and equally there's nothing stopping a Scottish distiller from triple distillation. I suppose traditional, it's open to debate, but traditional Irish whiskey 100 years ago would have been famed for being a thick, viscous, like real full-bodied whiskey. But that traditional style was almost completely lost. Irish whiskey, there's a traditional style of Irish whiskey referred to as pot still. It was notably very thick, viscous, sweet and spicy whiskey, famed for how much flavour was packed into it. And at one stage in the history, that made up over 90% of world's whiskey sales. But just over 100 years ago now, there was a collapse, like I said, in the industry, and the industry collapsed to a stage where in the 1970s it was made up less than 1% of the world whiskey market. So at that time there was a conscious decision made, we're going to have to do something to address this, and so Irish whiskey tried to re-emerge as this triple distilled, smooth, mellow alternative to Irish or to Scottish whiskey. Many of the complaints, I suppose, about Scotch is that sometimes it can be a bit overpowering or overwhelming for people. So Irish whiskey offered an alternative in the form of more mellow, smooth, easy drinking triple distillation, this kind of an idea. So that's what many people would think of Irish whiskey in the more recent times. But we here in Dingle, we don't make an awful lot of whiskey, but we want to try and pack it. We want to get back into that Irish traditional style, really packing in as much flavour into the glass as possible. We don't want to just be this another, this idea of that it's so easy to drink you'd forget your. We want the customer to be captivated by their glass and its contents. Not just this something so easy you wouldn't even know you're drinking it. We want to try and pack in a lot more flavour, get back to those sweet and spicy notes that Irish whiskey would have been noted for at one time. And there's many other distilleries coming in with that ethos as well. And hopefully, as an Irish whiskey fan, I'm very optimistic that there will be a lot of very interesting whiskies produced by this new wave of distilleries that are opening up. But we're very proud. We're only the second distillery in the world now producing pot still Irish whiskey, and the first to open in over 100 years. So it's a category that most people wouldn't even be aware of the style of whiskey, but we're happy to be involved in that renaissance of the style of whiskey here in Dingle. So yeah.
How do you produce your whiskey? What do you need for a start?
Well, to produce single malt whiskey, we produce two styles of whiskey here in Dingle. The first being one that most people would be aware of in single malt. Single malt whiskey is made up of three basic ingredients: malted barley, water and yeast. The first guys to distill whiskey here on the island, to produce any alcohol you need a sugar source. Unfortunately, when the Irish monks would have learned how to distill or produce alcohol in Europe out of grape, a very ample sugar source. But once they returned to Ireland, there is no grape and no real ample sugar source. But being Irish, they didn't quite want to give up on alcohol that easily. So they turned to alternatives, and the alternatives they found was barley. We're getting too deep into the science of it. Barley doesn't have any sugars, but it has starch, and starch is like a long chain of sugars. So if you can break that chain down into individual links, you get sugar. So barley seeds themselves do this naturally during their growth process or germination. So the first process or step in whiskey production and for beers is to malt the barley, activating enzymes naturally within the barley to start that breaking down of those chains of sugars. So that process referred to as malting. So single malt whiskey, 100% of the barley used will have been malted. You can use peat, very rarely is used here in Ireland, more of a tradition towards that in Scotland. You brew, you mash in and you brew basically a beer. It's like an ale, a very crude beer, higher in alcohol strength, and a very packed full with a lot of strange and some pleasant and maybe some not quite so pleasant flavour profiles. And then it's distilled a minimum of 2, but more often here in Ireland 3 times. And then after the distillation is complete, be it 2 or 3 times, it must go into a cask. A cask for at least 3 years by law here in Ireland. The most common cask type in use would be made up of oak, but Ireland is one of the only whiskey distilling nations in the world that actually allows the use of other woods if you were to wish, if you wanted to use them. Now, almost all casks used are oak, but sometimes there's a little bit of experimentation with things like chestnut and different oaks here as well, different woods here in Ireland. So yeah, the other style of whiskey I refer to is named as pot still. It gets its name from the apparatus, but don't think too much about it because that will only confuse you. The actual only difference between single malt whiskey and pot still whiskey is actually in the ingredient list. So it comes from one of the first taxes ever introduced on Irish whiskey was introduced by the British, and they tried to tax the litres of alcohol produced to little or no success because your distilleries operating at that time could have anywhere up to 300 men working in a distillery, and believe it or not, 300 men will consume an awful lot of the whiskey they produce, and they won't tell the taxman they did it either. So what the taxman figured out how to do was, instead of taxing the end product or the litres of alcohol, tax the raw ingredient, the malted barley. At that time, it was understood that you couldn't make whiskey without using malted barley. So they thought it was a very clever way of collecting taxes. But what the Irish distillers figured out is that you could actually use other cereal grains. So they started using unmalted barleys, things like oats, rye, purely to avoid taxation. The taxes were on the barley or the malted barley. So by using unmalted or oats or rye, they got very similar levels of extract, but far reduced rates of tax. It was done purely to avoid taxation and maybe a little bit to annoy the British, but it produced a style of whiskey referred to as pot still. And like I said earlier, it would be a lot more viscous, particularly if you have things like oats in it. It would be a lot more viscous and a thick liquid. Add a little bit of rye, it has more spice, but you get more of those characteristics as well from the unmalted barley as well. So we now are only one of 2 distilleries in the whole world producing this style of whiskey, but hopefully we're only the beginning, and there'll be many more that will follow on, because it's an amazing category that was almost completely forgot about, and almost completely was lost up until very recently. So it's good to see that it's coming back, and there's exciting things happening in the industry as well, and we're very proud to be part of that story as well.
How should people enjoy their whiskey? What temperature?
This is open for debate all the time, and I often get asked, because I'm meant to be an expert or a connoisseur or what I would say to people is enjoy their whiskey whatever way they like, and don't let anybody try. Your taste is your taste. Some people have what I would think is good taste and some people have bad, but it's your own taste. So if you as far as the science of whiskey, I personally, particularly for our whiskies, we bottle at a slightly higher alcohol strength of about 46.5% alcohol. That can be quite pungent for many people. The alcohol can, first of all, overpower the whiskey, or can overpower the palate, I should say. So what many find is that if you add a little drop of water, it helps to open up. And there are little clusters of flavour that will get trapped in the whiskey called micelles. If you add a little drop of water, it disperses these and releases more flavour into the glass. So I would probably recommend adding just a little drop of water to your whiskey. As far as ice is concerned, if you want to cool your whiskey, obviously add ice. My only advice on it would be, as far as the science of adding ice or not, the flavour molecules, the congeners, the esters that carry the flavour profile within the whiskey, if you cool them, they will thicken. And when they thicken, they're more difficult for your palate to process. So what people can find, and I would find myself, is that if you add a little bit of ice to the whiskey, it can actually trap some of the flavour profile. So recommendations would be to have the whiskey at room temperature or even slightly warmer. Particularly here in Ireland, room temperature can be quite cold often, but room temperature, and maybe add a little drop of water if you wish. But again, it's down to everyone. How you enjoy your whiskey is your business. So I don't mind, and I won't get too offended what you do with it. I might get a little offended if you add ginger ale or something, but water or ice is okay. It's okay. So yeah.
Okay, back to gin.
Yeah.
Person we talked to said we should drink it with grapefruit.
Yeah, that's. I agree with that, actually. And from a company point of view, I probably meant to say no, drink it with orange. But the distillery's recommended garnish is meant to be orange. It's one of our ingredients that we use in the actual gin recipe. But I actually find that something like grapefruit or even lime that has a little bit more bitterness actually cuts through the gin quite well and adds an extra dimension. So I prefer grapefruit, but each to their own again. Like I said, the distilleries, we had a vote. Not everything that happens in the distillery is decided by democracy. It's a bit of a dictatorship here sometimes. But one of the things I was overruled on was adding orange instead of grapefruit. But I was happy. I'll take that loss. There's many other things that I get my way with. So grapefruit. But each to their own. If you like it, some people like the sweet, a little bit more sweetness that comes from the orange, or some people like it even sweeter again. I know there's some people add strawberries, mint leaves to it, but I prefer more citrus, things like grapefruit myself.
Okay. Can we take a look at the process inside?
Yeah.
Okay,
Just
great.
be careful of the noise.
Ja. So, wir sind jetzt hier gerade im Herzen der Distille. Schöne Kupferkessel leuchten uns an. Es ist sehr warm. Oben gibt es eine Bar. Große, riesige Eichenfässer sehen wir hier. Und Michael macht gerade das Eichenfass auf. Und es dampft wunderbar und riecht gut.
Okay, so this would be the first step on site. This is our mash tun. So we produce 2 mashes per day, one at 6 o'clock in the morning, one starting at 2 o'clock. Today we're producing pot still whiskey, so we fill our mash tun with half a ton of malted barley, a half a ton of unmalted barley. We add in hot water at 65 degrees Celsius, which will reactivate all of those enzymes and hopefully break down all of the sugars contained within the grains. That process takes about an hour or so to complete, and then we will drain the liquid from this tank, a rich sugary liquid, and that gets pumped into one of our 5 fermentation vessels you see over here. So from each ton of grain we extract about 5,000 litres of what we would refer to as wort, rich sugary liquid, and into that then we add in yeast being a living organism, and it will get very excited by all of this sugar and hopefully convert it into a beer. Our fermentation lasts 3 days, fermenting it to a beer at about 8% alcohol. Now what you might notice about our fermentation vessel, which would be different to any ones you would have seen in certainly in a brewery, but most likely any other distillery as well, is that our fermentation vessels are wooden. The reason for wood over stainless steel would be a more common use for fermentation vessels now, and the reason for this is that it's a lot easier to clean and a lot easier to sterilize, and for guys brewing beer, that's very important. You don't want any contamination from any wild yeast or any strains of bacteria. But for us here in Dingle, we want a little bit of that wild yeast and a little bit of character. So we'll thoroughly clean all of our tanks between each batch, but it's just impossible to completely sterilise the wood. And this will harbour some slight bacterial growth, which will compete with our yeast during the fermentation. And it won't, instead of producing ethanol, like the yeast does, it will produce these congeners, these esters, and it'll add an extra layer of character to the beer that we're producing. Now, if it was a beer we were making or brewing here in Dingle just for to be consumed as is, it probably wouldn't be advisable, because it could have a lot of off flavours or unusual character that can be quite pungent. But for us in the distillery, we are then going to put that beer through a distillation process, so we can then refine and kind of pick out the flavours that we want and we don't want through our distillation process. So that's why we use wooden fermentation vessels here. The only other really place you'll find these in whiskey would be in the high-end single malt Scotch distilleries as well. So yeah, these are our fermentation vessels. Then over here we have our 3 whiskey stills. Basic idea of distillation is that the different components of the beer will have different boiling points. So as we collect everything off the first still, all the alcohol is distilled off and then put into the second still, and this is where we as distillers will go to work on the distillate. So the initial very volatile components to come off, the very first vapours to come off your still are the most volatile, but invariably the most dangerous. So things like methanol or potentially dangerous components come off at the beginning of distillation. Methanol, although there's not a lot of methanol produced in grain distillation, only a small bit can do an awful lot of damage. If you drink 10 ml of methanol, you go blind. If you drink 30 ml of methanol, you drop dead. So for obvious reasons, you don't want this making its way into your whiskey, your end product. So we can separate the liquid as it's collected from the still between basically a bad and a good receiver, or what we would call the feints and the heart of the run. So the initial dangerous components that come off at the beginning of distillation are directed towards the bad receiver. Once these clear, we'll collect into the good receiver, or the heart of the run, where we'll collect the good clean alcohol and the positive flavour profile for a number of hours, and then we'll monitor the distillation throughout, and towards the end of distillation, as the temperature builds up in the still, you'll get a lot of, again, undesirable, particular unpleasant flavour profile will start to get produced and distilled off. So simply because it doesn't taste very good, we'll again switch the flow of alcohol from the heart of the run back to the bad receiver, or what's referred to as the tails cut. Now, in a double distillation distillery, this is where the story would end, but we triple distill, so we will take that heart of the run and it goes on to the third and final distillation, where we can again devise between a good and a bad receiver. But on this third distillation in particular, it's done purely for flavour profile reasons. So if you can imagine, as the distillation takes about 8 to 10 hours to complete, and over the course of that time it'll produce a whole spectrum of different flavour profiles, some quite delicate and floral, particularly at the beginning, some rich sweet flavour profiles, some more cereal note, right down to kind of a waxy rubbery character at the very end. So depending on where you make your cuts, you can influence the flavour profile of the distillate you end up collecting. So we here in Dingle have a rich sweet distillate with a little bit of spice to it, only a subtle bit of spice, but a largely rich sweet distillate. But that's because those are the cuts I've set out here for us, and that's the style of distillate we're trying to produce. But if there was a different head distiller in charge, they might have a different ethos, and he or indeed she might choose to collect a more floral character or more cereal notes. So this is why, although there's only 3 basic ingredients used in single malt whiskey production, and 4, I suppose, in single pot still. You can have a massive variance in the different distillates produced by different distilleries. And this is largely down to the different cutting points that take place at your stills. All of these cuts mean that we start off with 5,000 litres of beer. We end up collecting just 500 litres of whiskey spirit from each batch. Now, it's at higher concentration of alcohol, obviously, but only a very small proportion of what goes into the stills is of a high enough quality to make its way out of the third and final distillation. And that then must go into our casks for a minimum of 3 years, but you can leave it as long as you wish, sometimes up to 30 years and beyond. So yeah, I don't know if we'll have the patience here in Dingle for a 30-year maturation, but we're trying our best anyway.
We're coming back.
yeah. So yeah, I suppose I can bring you over here. I can show you our spirit safe. This is where our alcohol is analysed and where the distillers will make their cuts.
Ein Messing-Schächtelchen, in dem dann doch einige Flüssigkeiten vorhanden sind.
Yeah, so this is what's called a spirit safe. This is basically a means of analysing our distillate where we can test the alcohol. You can see here, this is the collection point from our first still. It's quite a robust and you can see it's gushing out of the still. This is our most basic, our most crude of our distillations. Everything collected off the first still goes into one receiver. That all gets pumped into the second still, where you can see here I have two. You can divide the liquid into two different vessels. So I can do that by pivoting the flow of alcohol here. I won't do it at the moment, but we can divide between a bad and a good receiver. We're quite unusual in Dingle in that the cuts, now we obviously have to be very careful for the methanol and the different volatiles at the beginning of the second distillation. But after that, all of the rest of the cuts are made for taste reasons or for the flavour profile of the whiskey. And so the way that we decide upon when to make the cuts is by taste and smell. We have absolutely no automation here on site. All of the valves, everything is moved and turned to steam, everything is done manually. And also the cuts here are decided upon manually. So most distilleries will use automation. It's cheaper and you can just work off volumes or timings. The difficulty with this is that doesn't allow for any variance between batch to batch. In particular for us, there is slight variance depending on how your fermentation goes and so on. There can be subtle variances between batch to batch, and if you simply make your cuts by timings or by volumes, some days you might end up collecting stuff you shouldn't have, and other days you might end up missing out on something you should collect. So we'll monitor the distillations throughout, nosing the whiskey and the distillate, I should say, throughout the course of the distillation, and ultimately tasting before any cuts are made. So it's one of the, for me anyway, one of the more pleasant jobs to have to do inside here in the distillery is to carry out the analysis and the cutting points here on the different distillations of whiskey. So yeah, that's our spirit safe. Tucked away over here in the corner then is our gin and vodka still Ushin. So it's a lot smaller in scale. You can see the scale size difference. Lot smaller, but very hard working all the same. So I suppose there's a couple of unusual things about our gin and vodka still. Number one, although it's a lot smaller, it is also made out of copper. So most vodka stills and most gin stills also wouldn't be made out of copper. The reason for this, or the reason that many aren't, is that it's an expensive metal. They're expensive stills to produce, and they're very expensive to run. But the benefit for us, and the benefit for anyone in using copper stills, is that copper will react with impurities within the alcohol, particularly things like sulfurous components. It'll create copper sulfate. This will remain in the belly of the still and not into the end product, so it produces a far cleaner, crisper, smoother alcohol. That's very important well, for both the gin and the vodka and the whiskey, by regulation, you cannot make single malt or single pot still whiskey in any other type of still. But there's no such regulation around gin and vodka production. So for many distilleries, particularly up until recent times, it wasn't deemed a necessary expense. But there's, I suppose, in more modern times now, people are becoming more educated about their products and are seeking out their brands. We're moving away, I suppose, from just this core main gin brand and a core main vodka brand. People are trying to find their own favourites, and there are various reasons as to why you should choose different gins. We have this benefit here of although it makes it a more expensive process, we deem it a necessary expense. For the purities, it gives a lot higher levels of purities in your vodka and in your gin. The gin or the vodka is quite simple. Vodka is basically ethanol and water, so there's no flavour profile, or at least there shouldn't be. It should be neutral. So the only real marks of quality for vodka is its purity levels. So we hope to create a very pure, clean alcohol through our copper distillation, and then the only other ingredient is water from our own wells here in Dingle. So there's one thing there's no shortage of in Ireland, is water. So we get some of the purest water from 2 wells here on site in the distillery to cut it back. The gin is quite similar up until the last stage of distillation. You distill your alcohol to as high a level of purity as possible, and then in the final distillation you add in a number of different flavour profiles. The main one for gin has to be derived from juniper berries, but beyond juniper you can use whatever other botanicals you wish. So when we were setting up here in Dingle 5 years ago, there was only one other gin produced in the country. There's different, more craft or whatever word you want to use, distilleries popping up around the world using Mediterranean or Oriental or various different botanicals. But we were setting up here in Dingle, so it made sense to us to use botanicals available to us here in Dingle. So the core backbone, I suppose, comes from a traditional ingredients. Juniper obviously has to be the main flavour profile. But beyond juniper, there are some more traditional botanicals like coriander seeds, some form of citrus. So we use lemon and orange peel. We use nutmeg and cinnamon and some angelica. Now these would largely, most of these would be in most gins in different proportions. But beyond those traditional botanicals, we chose to use as many local botanicals as possible. So we forage for things like fuchsia, we use heather, bog myrtle, hawthornberry, rowanberry, and sherbel, and 13 botanicals in total, and these will all soak into the alcohol for 24 hours. And it's the actual fruits, the flowers, the berries themselves that we use, not some essence or anything else. So it's fresh botanicals where possible, or else we will either dry or freeze the different berries. So we'll harvest, say, hawthornberry, for example, comes into bloom in October, November, the end of the year. So when it's there, there's a plentiful supply on the peninsula, but it's only available, of course, for a very short period of time. Things like the heather and fuchsia are available for longer periods, but again, not available year-round. So we'll dry or freeze the botanicals for use year-round. So the recipe stays the same for the original gin year-round. We let it soak into the alcohol for 24 hours before it's then distilled off. But you'll notice another difference between our gin stills and our whiskey stills is this little pot up here on the neck of the still. This is what's called the flavour basket, and the use of the flavour basket is particular for many of the local botanicals. Things like the fuchsia and heather are very delicate, and although they give off a lot of aroma on the nose as raw botanicals, through distillation you don't really get as much character as we would like. So to ensure that they do contribute that extra layer to our gin, we have this little basket where we can pack in the more delicate botanicals, and so as the vapours travel up and out of the still, they pass through this basket and hopefully then pick up that extra layer of aromatic character. and impart a subtle floral undertone to our gin as well. So that's thanks to our flavour basket. Up until right now, every drop of Dingle gin or vodka has been distilled in this little guy in the corner. So when I was saying earlier that we couldn't keep up with demand, a lot of it is to do with how popular the product has been here in Ireland, but also the fact that we haven't been able to produce an awful lot. We produce about 1,000 bottles of gin or alternative vodka per day at current production capacity. But over in the middle of the distillery here, we have a new brother, or I suppose sister for Oisín. That's a 2,000 litre still, so it's a lot bigger. It will allow us to produce about 4,000 bottles of gin per day, which, like I said, the plan for that would be to hopefully expand and grow a little further in the Irish market, but particularly internationally. We have Germany being one of the big places that you're big fans of gin, and we have many fans of our gin in Germany, and a distribution network and our distributors, they were our first international distributors, were in Germany, and we were very excited by that in the very early days. We set up this international market, and as soon as we did, sales just went crazy here domestically, and we couldn't fulfill any of our promises we've made. So we've been drip feeding little bits of gin to Germany and other international markets, but we will hopefully be able to send a lot more over your way in the near future, thanks to this new still here. So yeah.
Yeah, I've got a fun fact for that. Last year we went also to Bantry Bay, and then we met the person that recommended Dingle gin to us, right. And we looked for a flask of Dingle gin, and we saw one in a bar in Rosslare. And we wanted to buy it, and they said, "Oh, we can't sell it to you. It's the only Dingle gin we have. we don't sell it. Only if you want to drink it now." Yeah. So okay, we have to go to the ferry then.
Yeah, that's been one of the. I suppose that's been one of the difficulties with the success. Success is great, but the reason we chose to really focus on domestic market is that we wanted to keep the domestic market as strong as possible. It has been a difficulty that we do very often sell out, even here in Ireland, particularly in the summer months. Many bars struggle to keep bottles on the shelves. It has meant that some ask a very high price point, and you can't blame them. People are happy to pay a higher price point to get it. But we didn't want to, as a distillery, we didn't want to increase our prices. We've been asking a fair price, we feel, for our gin, and we didn't want to get ahead of ourselves and start asking big high price points for the gin. We wanted to keep the market as strong as possible, and one of the difficulties when you sell out in a bar is that the bar owner can become quite frustrated, and every day they'll have a new gin salesman or whoever in offering an alternative. Sure, if you can't keep Dingle on the shelf, we'll give you all the X gin or Y gin, whatever. So we wanted to try and avoid that as much as possible. So that's why we focused on keeping it on the shelves as much as we could here domestically, before growing our international markets. So, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I suppose the last step as far as production is concerned, takes place in our oak casks. So you can see a couple over here. We use for Irish whiskey, and for other whiskey styles. I suppose how oak casks came into use the first stage was purely because there was no alternatives. 1,000 years ago there was no real glass or plastic or anything, so monks had to store it in something, and they chose oak. Oak is a strong, durable wood, relatively impervious to liquid, so it'll hold your whiskey and survive transport quite well. But what we've found in the last couple of 100 years is that actually the oak will have a big impact on the whiskey if you leave it in there for longer than just transport time. So number one, it changes the colour, obviously, of the whiskey. But secondly, it will change the flavour profile. Now, what we've found is that in Ireland and in Scotland, if you were to use a brand new oak cask, the oak itself is too dominant, particularly in its first 18 months of use. As far as spirit production is concerned, the oak contributes an awful lot of tannins and colour and different flavour components to the whiskey. So much so that it would actually really overpower your whiskey spirit. And so I can talk about all of the rich, sweet distillate that we produce here in Dingle, or it might be a more floral distillate produced, but it wouldn't matter. It would all end up largely tasting of the oak. So what we do in Ireland and in Scotland is we use casks that have been used at least once before. The most common cask type in use in Ireland and Scotland would be bourbon. The benefit to using bourbon is that the bourbon producer tends to mature their whiskey has to mature the whiskey in a brand new oak cask each time, American oak cask, and then once they use it, they cannot reuse it again. So that's where we as Irish or Scotch whiskey distillers will step in, then we buy those casks. During its maturation, the bourbon will have leached back the overpowering character from the oak, and then it will leave a more balanced, conducive environment for us as Irish or Scotch whiskey producers. The oak will still have a lot to contribute, but not enough to overpower the whiskey. Now, the most common cask type in use in Ireland and Scotland for over 95% of whiskey produced here would be matured in a bourbon cask. Now, there are various reasons as to why bourbon is the most common use, but the reality as to why bourbon is so prevalent is that it's by far the cheapest. A bourbon cask costs less than €100 depending on your source for the bourbon casks. Your alternatives are to use things like particular fortified wines like sherry, port or Madeira, but the possibilities are endless. But the difficulty with these casks is they can, depending on the quality of the cask, you can be spending anywhere up to €1,000 and beyond in some cases for your cask. So for your accounts departments are often can't understand the logic of using anything other than bourbon casks. Now, bourbon is and does wonderful things to Irish whiskey, and we do use bourbon casks. We get our bourbon from Basil Hayden, producing a bourbon with a high rye content, so it adds that extra little bit of spice to our whiskey. They're slightly more expensive, but the quality of the casks are very good. But where the industry norms would be about 90 or 95%, we would only use about 30% of our casks would be bourbon. Our most common cask type would be sherry, but even within the sherry category, we would use We use 6 different types of sherry cask. Some quite sweet, like Pedro Jimenez, or some quite savoury and nutty like Amontillado. They're quite dry. And depending, obviously, like sherry is a very different product to Irish whiskey. So as the sherry does the same job as the bourbon, it can strip back a lot of the overpowering character, but it will also impart strange and unusual character of its own. So it'll add an extra layer of complexity. And for us, when we were setting up here, particularly for me, I was first and foremost an Irish whiskey fan. And my only gripe with the industry at that time was there was some fantastic distillates being produced, but it only went into bourbon and maybe a little bit of Oloroso sherry, and then all of the whiskey releases were more or less the same thing, just in different ratios of sherry and bourbon, and I was curious as to what would it be like in a port cask, what would it be like in a Madeira. So we use sherry, port, Madeira, we use some Caribbean rum casks, we use various French red wine casks, we use some champagne, we use over 20 different cask types here in Dingle, and all of these different cask types will then impart a different influence onto the whiskey over the course of the maturation. It'll do a couple of different things. It will add all of these extra layers of complexity, and it will satisfy, well, maybe not satisfy, but it'll go a long way to satisfy my curiosity as to what hot still Irish whiskey would be like in these various cask types. The difficulty for us as the distillery is that we produce about 4 casks of whiskey per day, and so when you use over 20 different cask types, we have a massive variety, but not a whole lot of any one style of whiskey. So when it comes to releasing, we're slightly different than what most people would, or well, how pretty much everyone else does it. So if you think of a distillery like a Middleton, you think of Middleton produce, their main brand would be Jameson, or if you think of Bushmills, have their Bushmills brand, and a couple of different variances on that. But the Dingle distillery, we are going to have to release in batches. So in 2016 we released our first whiskey. Batch 1 was matured in bourbon casks. Batch 2 was matured in sherry, Oloroso, Pedro Jimenez, and a little bit of bourbon. And our third release that's coming up will have been matured in port casks.
It's like wine. It's like wine in Germany.
Yeah, so you'll have your different vintages kind of yeah, it'll differ from year to year. So we're not necessarily having it's not specifically, it's a similar idea, but it's not down to necessarily the harvest of grape. It's down to just our whatever casks we feel are ready. So our batch 1, we're still releasing in very small quantities. Our first 2 batches were only made up of about 7,000 bottles each. Our third batch that we're releasing next week now will be closer to 13,000. So it'll be, for us, our biggest release to date, but still a very small release of whiskey. But all of them very different, all of them very unusual. So, and that will be the trend moving forward. We may find that certain casks work better with our distillate than others. But again, see, this is down to each individual's personal taste. And one of my, I quite like what the sherry casks are particular. Well, I have 2 favourites within the sherry. The Pedro Jimenez adds a rich, sweet, like dark fruits, an extra layer of that complexity to what is already a rich, sweet distillate. So for us, the sweeter cask types tend to complement our style of distillate. But we have a couple of Amontillado sherry casks as well, and a lot of the reason for setting up here in Dingle on southwesternmost coast of Ireland is to do with the climate here in Dingle. We're obviously quite close to the sea, and that has a number of benefits. The main one is that it means that we have a nice, mild, consistent year-round temperature, although the weather is very good. This is our one day of summer we're getting here today. The sun is shining in Dingle, but it's not always this warm, but it's very rarely all that cold either. Because of the Gulf Stream passing us by here, our winters tend to be pretty much the same as our summers, to be honest. You're never too far away from rain, it's never too hot, it's never too cold. But this is good for whiskey. Whiskey doesn't mature in a cask below temperatures of about 6 degrees Celsius. But we here in Dingle very rarely get temperatures that will go down that low. So we get a nice year-round maturation occurring in the cask. As well as that, there's the maritime influence, the salt, the higher oxygen levels, and that's sea salt in the air. And we're finding that in our casks, that is picking up particularly maritime influences, particularly in the casks that we're maturing here in our warehouse. The one that's, like, if you take the wrong step when you go out the front door, you fall into the sea. So these are picking up that extra layer, and our Amontillado is quite nutty, savoury. And the longer we're leaving it in the cask, is picking up more of that savoury maritime influence. That's probably a lot to do with the climate here in Dingle, as well as the influence of the cask. So, but they're my favourites. Eamon, our distiller for today here beside me, probably has a very different opinion, and I'm sure everyone will. Every time we do a tasting of the different distillates, you'll always have differences of opinion as to what is the best. I suppose the benefit to what we've done, although we won't have a consistent product, that if you do fall in love with it, there will only be a finite amount of that whiskey available. But it'll also mean that the curiosity, and there's something new and interesting to try all of the time from us here in Dingle. Yeah.
Okay. if you want to book a tour with you.
Yeah, so we offer tours year round. So pretty much every day of the year. We close down for Christmas, and that's about it. So 7 days a week. If anyone wants to come and visit us, they can contact us via email at tours@dingledistillery.ie, or you can simply go on our Facebook page, send us a message. So we offer tours, like I said, year round. Booking would probably be advisable, particularly in the summer months. We put on extra tours, but a lot of people come a long way, often to visit us here in the distillery, and not having booked in advance. And we can only, it is first and foremost a production facility. So the tour takes you right through our brew house, right by the stills and everything. But we're quite caught for space, and obviously the sounds and the noise of everything working. So we only take about 25 people on each tour. So certain times, particularly in the summer months, these tours can all book out. So if you just send us a little message in advance, we'd be happy to welcome anyone and everyone to the distillery here and show them what we're up to.
Okay, thank you very much for your
at all.
time, and hope you have good sales. Get on with the capacity, which is great. Then we can also enjoy our Dingle whiskey or gin in Germany too.
No, thanks very much for calling, and thanks for the support in Germany as well. We have a lot of fans of our whiskey and gin in Germany, and we haven't made it very easy for them to be fans. It's not very easy to get your hands on our products in Germany, but I promise we'll make it a lot easier in the near future. So yeah, thanks very much for calling, and thanks for the support.
So, das war jetzt eine wirklich sehr lange Folge, in dem euch Fee und Michael in die Geheimnisse der Whisky-Herstellung eingeweiht haben. Ich finde, die beiden haben das mit so viel Leidenschaft erklärt, dass ich es einfach nicht über das Herz gebracht habe, sie mit meinen Kommentaren zu unterbrechen oder diese Folge zu kürzen. Deshalb ist dieser zweite Podcast auch fast doppelt so lang wie ursprünglich angekündigt. Das Rauschen im Hintergrund war nicht das Mikrofon, sondern der Lärm in der Produktionshalle. In Wirklichkeit war es noch viel, viel lauter, aber unser Mikro hat einen wirklich guten Job gemacht und den meisten Lärm ausgefiltert. Ich hoffe, das ist deshalb nicht so schlimm. In 2 Wochen sind wir wieder auf Sendung bei den Schlossherren und den Piraten von Baltimore. Ich hoffe, ihr seid dann auch wieder mit dabei. Wenn euch unser Podcast gefallen hat, dann würde uns eine 5-Sterne-Wertung und eine gute Rezension auf iTunes sehr freuen.